The following is a presentation from the MJCast, the internet's premier podcast on all things Michael Jackson.
I'm a Black American. I am proud of who I am.
Together, we can make a change in the world. I want to see you!
I like to take sounds and put them on the microscope.
There's a driving bass, you become the bass.
Let the music write itself.
I don't sing it if I don't mean it.
Welcome to the MJCast, your source of news, discussion, and interviews on the King of Pop.
Hello, and welcome to episode 177 of the MJCast, our Leaving Neverland 2 Roundtable. I'm Charles Thompson. In 2019, a bomb exploded in the Michael Jackson world when British TV director Dan Reed premiered a 4-hour TV series about Wade Robson and James Safechuck, two men demanding millions of dollars from Michael Jackson's posthumous estate as compensation for alleged childhood sexual abuse. A co-production between Britain's Channel 4 and America's HBO, the show generated months of scandalous, sensational, and extraordinarily biased media coverage, much of it demanding the all-out cancellation of Michael Jackson. For a while that looked like a possibility, but ultimately Jackson weathered the storm. His music streams went up instead of down. A Michael Jackson musical debuted on Broadway, won a string of awards, and has become one of the highest-grossing shows in New York theatre history. Its London transfer has repeatedly extended its run due to phenomenal demand, just been nominated for 3 prestigious Olivier Awards, and new versions have now opened in Germany and Australia. Meanwhile, Lionsgate has invested $150 million in the most expensive Hollywood biopic of all time, all about Michael Jackson. But 6 years later, Dan Reed has re-emerged with a 49-minute sequel, subtitled Surviving Michael Jackson, and focusing on Robson and Safechuck's ongoing legal efforts to obtain millions of dollars from Jackson's estate. It premiered this week to substantially less fanfare than its predecessor, and we're here today to talk all about it. I'm joined for this show by a roster of familiar names. Dialing in from Los Angeles, we have Michael Jackson's nephew and the Jackson family's loudest voice against Leaving Neverland and the allegations it contains, Taj Jackson. From Ohio, we have longtime fan Jenny Winings, who was on the witness list for Michael Jackson's 2005 trial and actually features in Leaving Neverland 2. From Sydney, our own filmmaking expert and one of the MJCast's resident editors, Paul Black. And from MJ Innocent, the campaign group which fought back against Leaving Neverland in 2019 by buying ad space all over London's bus fleet, Anika Kotecha. So the show debuted this week on Channel 4 in the UK to extremely disappointing viewership figures. Less than 500,000 people tuned in, which was less than a quarter of the number that tuned in for Part 1 in 2019. The show has come back for its sequel without HBO as a co-partner, and instead is airing in America on YouTube. When it premiered on YouTube, my friend Rashid Musbah, a fantastic researcher in the Michael Jackson world, was tuning in to watch it. There were a grand total of 578 people watching the live premiere on YouTube. So far this week, it's been watched by just 31,000 people. So the show has been something of a failure, a damp squib. I'm interested to find out, firstly, from people that have seen it, because I know we've got a mixture of people on the show who have seen it and people who haven't seen it. So Paul, I know that you've seen it.
Yeah.
What were your impressions?
Yeah, I don't think anybody in the general public will find this particularly interesting. I mean, I expected it to be kind of explosive, and I think it's extremely niche. And, you know, people have said that it's even a little bit boring. So clearly nothing remotely interesting or explosive happened, you know, during court hearings and things like that. It's far from a compelling courtroom drama. To me, it kind of felt a bit like a boring preview before the release of the story that you would generally want to hear. And it probably could have been about 10 minutes. They seem to take the first half to remind you what happened last time and get you up to speed. And then they just kind of wrapped it up as nothing has really, really developed or happened in an amazing way. And they seem to be holding out for a part 3. So I kind of expected there to be more about the impact or the toll it was taking on James and Wade and their fight and their battle and pulling at heartstrings, but they both seem pretty kind of blasé about it all. So yeah, I didn't think it was particularly engaging storytelling and, text on screen and the footage they were using. And I remember looking at the clock at the 22-minute mark and I'm like, well, nothing's happened yet. And then 32 minutes and nothing much has happened. And then 34 minutes, they got into the court stuff. It just wasn't really a super compelling piece of work. And we can get into it later and talk a bit more about, the construction of documentary and editing. And that's kind of where my background is, that kind of thing. So let's get other people's thoughts. But that's kind of my initial reaction to it.
And Anika, I think you also have seen it, and you said that you had a similar reaction to Paul.
Yes, absolutely. I found it really boring. And that's coming from, as I said to you earlier, someone who takes obviously a keen interest in pretty much everything Michael. I think the first, I'd say 15 or so minutes felt a bit sensationalist, where they were quite explicit in some of the detail that they were sharing. But after that, there didn't seem to be anything particularly new, nothing that really held my interest. So I can't really imagine the general public being that interested in this next episode of it.
Now, Taj, you were saying before we started recording that you actually haven't seen it. So is that a conscious decision you've made, or is it just that you haven't got around to it yet?
Yeah, it was a conscious decision, definitely. It's a little different for me because I feel like watching those kind of things, it kind of taints my memory. As it is, I hold on to my memories very preciously of my uncle. And it's almost like I would equate it to a tape player and, erasing over something. And I just don't want those memories. As it was, the clips I saw of Leaving Neverland, the first one, I never looked at the train station the same way. And it really bothers me that they have, I guess, that power to do that. I've said it before. I every time I see them, I want to throw my shoe at the TV screen because I can't see how someone doesn't know that they're lying, but I do understand that people don't have the same experience that I've had.
And Jenny, you're actually in Leaving Neverland too, and yet you've also not watched it. So how has it come to be that you've not seen it? Weren't you excited to see yourself on the screen?
So I also consciously did not watch it. I will say I probably started it and got 3 seconds into seeing one of their faces, and I just had to turn it off because I see their face and it looks staged and rehearsed. And I mean, I'm only in it 2 or 3 seconds, which I did not know until it came out if he was going to use the clip or not. I did have a heads up. I gave permission because this way that he can't say he went to people defending Michael and everyone said no. So, I mean, it's very, very brief, but I did not know that he was using the clip till someone told me. For my own mental sanity, I will not watch it. I pretty much know what it's about, especially with nothing new in it. So I know me, and I did not want to put myself through the anger that I would have felt watching it.
One thing that I personally have found quite shocking about this round of sort of promo for Leaving Neverland 2 is how little press it's been given compared to the first one, given how hostile the press is generally to Michael Jackson. I would have thought that they would have been going into overdrive to promote it. And in fact, I bought a couple of Sunday papers this week just gone by, the weekend before it was due to air. It wasn't even mentioned in the papers. And actually, some of the reviews in the British press have been pretty negative, saying that it's boring, that it doesn't add anything, that it's essentially a waste of time. So I personally have found that quite surprising because we know that the press generally has certainly a vested interest and seems to take a sort of glee in pouncing on any opportunity to attack Michael Jackson or promote the allegations against him. So, Anika, you're here in the UK with me. Have you been similarly surprised? And what do you think is going on here?
Yes, I was. I did think there would be a lot more publicity and press reaction on this. I think maybe what happened last time has guided the reaction a little bit this time. They saw how quickly and how easy it was to debunk virtually everything in Leaving Neverland. And they were also aware that this new Leaving Neverland had very, very little to add. So I think they were maybe a bit cautious. And I think they also recognize that public perception has changed. People are not going to buy into this same story over and over. And it seems that a lot of people now see it for what it is, a money grab. So I think they were probably going off a little bit on public sentiment as well.
Taj, have you seen a difference this time around in the number of media approaches you're getting? I know that the family was inundated with press asking for comments and interviews the first time around. Have you had much communication from press and media?
Yeah, there were a couple of people that had approached me. I made the conscious decision that I didn't want to be on TV ahead of it airing. I had a feeling that it was going to crash and burn, and I was hoping that it would. I do feel in my gut that probably that low number that it got, probably 2/3 of it were fans still. People are over it. People want to celebrate Michael now, and those that don't, they bark loud, but they're very much in the minority. The times at that point in 2019, it was Me Too and Time's Up, and it was a movement, and you couldn't even, speak against Leaving Neverland. You couldn't raise your voice and say this is phony or whatever. People weren't hearing it, and I think it's different times now. There's been many false allegations on some of people's favorite people, and they've started to realize that sometimes the media lies.
Are you shocked by how low the figures are? I mean, when Rashid texted me and said, I'm watching the premiere on YouTube right now, there's 578 people watching. I genuinely was quite staggered by that.
I was praying that it would be that low. The engagement on X or Twitter was very low, and I started noticing that even with Variety or Deadline or Billboard, a lot of those kind of comments, I would look at the numbers of how many followers they would have, and in the millions, and be like 5,000 views, or it would be like 50 comments. And I was like, okay, the numbers are just not adding up. I don't think anyone cares. And so, I mean, look, I'm pleasantly surprised. I'm grateful that, and that just that's a testament to the fans and everyone that spread the news and spread the truth about Michael. That's kind of what happened. It's 5 years, 6 years of really educating people.
It's also simply, as I said, it's just not compelling, particularly to the general public. And to me, it just feels like they're actually not ready to make this doco yet, because there's no developments, there's no story here. And Charles, you mentioned something once about possibly there was a contractual obligation that they had to release something, they had to come out with a follow-up. Because in the world of filmmaking and storytelling and everything else, normally you would just not make this documentary because they're just not ready. The whole purpose seemed to be to let the world know that there's a big trial coming up, and that's really the story, and that might be the part that everyone might be interested in. But as it stands, this just felt like kind of a little bit redundant. And I know that they followed one of the lawyers who ended up leaving, and then they've brought in the next lawyer, so it feels like that would have been an odd thing to do in one documentary. So maybe they're trying to say, well, let's get this little mini version out, but the real story will be when the trial happens and what happens with that. So I think if anyone tuned in to watch this expecting similar kind of bombshells like the previous one, and as Taj said, and you guys have said, it didn't really have the impact that they thought it might and cancel Michael. If people are tuning into this one, they're going to see a rehash of a bunch of stuff. Then they're going to see a lot of courtroom stuff that was filmed during the pandemic. So everyone's wearing masks. So you can't really see people's faces or expressions or emotions. And it's all filmed from the backs of their heads and things. So it's even, if it was a courtroom style drama on the developments, it's just visually and storytelling wise really not engaging. It's particularly dull. And then just when you think the courtroom stuff isn't strong enough, they decide, well, we're going to film a Zoom meeting. And so the next part of that hearing happens over Zoom. So we're cutting to a guy sitting there in a chair, nodding his head. And, we've all been through the pandemic and the Zoom stuff. It's not exactly engaging television. So it just feels like it's not a really compelling piece of work. And maybe, as you said, Charles, do you think it was a contractual obligation just to get something out, to keep the momentum going in preparation for 2026?
I mean, I do think that there probably is an element of contractual obligation. I remember the story being reported when they signed the deal for the sequel. I mean, it was like 5 years ago. So, and Channel 4 is currently in a terrible funding crisis and is really struggling to commission new shows. So it might also be that Channel 4 was putting some pressure on and saying, we've got holes in our schedule. We signed a deal with you 5 years ago. Where's the sequel? But I do think there's more of an ulterior motive, personally. And I think, essentially, I read the whole show as a threat to whichever judge ends up presiding over the eventual trial and the lead up to that trial, and also an implicit threat to the jury that end up sitting in that trial. And I think the threat is this. It's the whole show is basically them complaining about anybody who criticizes the allegations, anybody who says, I'm skeptical, and also them complaining about the courts essentially obeying the law, and saying the law is set up to attack and undermine victims, and the judges are siding with this giant corporation. The judges are all corporate patsies, and the law is a disgrace, and the judges should be standing up for complainants in these kind of cases. So I certainly read the show as basically like a threat to the trial judge of any time you make a decision that goes against us. And when I say us, I'm talking about Dan Reed and Wade Robson and James Safechuck and their lawyers, who are all acting in concert. There's no question about that at all. Anytime you do something that we don't like, that's going in the next one. That's going in the next documentary. If we request to submit a particular piece of evidence and you rule it inadmissible, that's going in the documentary. If we want to call a particular witness and you say no, that's going in the documentary. So that was my reading of it. It's like, there's a contractual obligation here, and it's a bit cobbled together to serve a purpose. But also my reading of it was threatening. It was, watch your back, because there's going to be a third one here. And every time you cheese us off, you increase your chances of becoming the star of the next documentary in a very bad way. Anika, I mean, I do want to get into the content of the show, and of course that's going to be difficult because we've got some people on the call who haven't seen it. But Anika, am I overreacting, or did you get that kind of vibe from it as well?
I did wonder if this was an attempt to influence any potential jury. I'm not sure how successful it's been, just given the viewing numbers and the total lack of interest that there seems to have been. The other thing I thought was maybe because of and I use this in quotation marks, but because of the success of Leaving Neverland 1, did Reed think he could continue to ride that wave with this one, and that it would maybe have at least some of the impact that the first Leaving Neverland had? Maybe again, radio stations might be thinking, we shouldn't play Michael, or there would be a huge wave of anti-Michael sentiment from the public. But I mean, that spectacularly failed.
Can I just ask, Jenny, what has been your experience so far of public reaction to the show? So I know you've not watched the show, but in your life, have you encountered people yet who've seen it? Have people wanted to talk to you about it, ask you questions about it? Or has it really passed by and made no dent at all?
In my personal life, everybody that already knew me for years, they didn't even waste time watching it because they were talking to me about it, or not necessarily talking, like asking me questions about it, but they knew my stance on it. And the people I have in my life now, my friends, have been close friends of mine for 15 plus years. So they've known all about my situation with Michael and everything in my life. So they didn't even give this 2 minutes of time. So in my personal life, I haven't really come across anybody that tries to talk to me about it. Of course, online is something totally different, but in my personal life, it hasn't been much about it at all. Since it came out, nobody was really even bothering to watch it or read about it.
And so not even colleagues or office chatter or anything like that, you've really not encountered any kind of public discussion about it at all?
No, I work in a restaurant, and the restaurant I work in, I'm very fortunate. It's like a family. It's an independently owned restaurant, very busy. We're all friends, and so they already knew. They already know my stories and my experiences, and they already know my stance on it. And they've known my stance on it since before I even worked there. So they don't even bother to read anything about it or watch anything about it.
So for those who've not seen it, it kind of kicks off not only with a rehash of the allegations that were made in Leaving Neverland 1, but also with a sort of a quick run through of the history of allegations against Michael. And interestingly, it doesn't use Geordie Chandler as sort of ground zero, or square one, to coin another phrase. It uses another alleged accuser called Jane Doe in the 1980s, and the timeline begins with this female alleged accuser who is described as a tomboy, who Vincent Finaldi, Wade and James's lawyer, states in the show received a settlement, and they show on the screen a series of checks that were allegedly made out to this accuser for large sums. Now, those who've been following the story will remember that at one point, Wade and James's lawyers were also representing Jane Doe, and then her case just suddenly completely disappeared and was never mentioned again until now. It then runs through Chandler in a kind of a deceptive way. There are a couple of things that they do there when they're talking through the Chandler case which are not quite accurate. For example, they talk about the naked photo shoot, and they have a detective who worked on the case who says, "I heard that it was a match." So for anyone listening that doesn't know, Geordie Chandler allegedly was able to describe Michael Jackson's genitals, and the government obtained a warrant forcing Michael Jackson to pose for a naked photo shoot so that they could compare the photographs to the alleged description. What we know is that Michael Jackson was not arrested or charged after those pictures were taken. And we also know that the authorities told Reuters news agency that there was no match. And we also know that months later, Katherine Jackson, Michael's mother, was called to the grand jury and questioned about whether Michael had had plastic surgery to his penis to avoid a match. So the evidence that's all in the public domain strongly suggests that there was no match. But in the TV show, they have this detective who worked on the case, a female detective, who kind of fudges it by saying, "Oh, from what I heard through the grapevine, it was a match." The other issue that they fumble, almost certainly deliberately, is the settlement. The settlement is not described accurately or fairly at all, and strongly indicates that the criminal case closed as a result of the civil settlement in the Chandler case, which is obviously not true. It then runs through Francia, and then Arvizo, and then up to Wade and James. And so it does, in its own way, it presents a very compelling argument to somebody that doesn't know the facts of the case, that suggests there is this long and very convincing pattern of Michael being accused. Now, Taj, I wanted to ask you about this, actually, because Jane Doe is a very mysterious case that nobody really knows much about. As I say, Wade and James's lawyers were representing her at one point, then the case suddenly disappeared. They state as fact in the documentary that she made allegations and received a civil settlement, and then they show all these checks. To your knowledge, is there any evidence that this female accuser was actually in receipt of any kind of settlement?
Not to my knowledge, no, not at all. I just thought she disappeared. I obviously didn't see Leaving Neverland 2, so I can't put it in context, but the Jane Doe thing's always very interesting to me because it really goes against the narrative of Michael with boys, basically. So I'm very interested in finding out more about that aspect of it, and if there's any truth or validity to that.
Yeah, I think around the time of Leaving Neverland, it was just completely dropped like a stone because it so flagrantly flew in the face of the narrative that was being peddled by Leaving Neverland 1, which was very, very specifically that Michael Jackson had a sexual interest in prepubescent boys and had targeted a string of prepubescent boys and would lose interest in them when they hit puberty and then move on to a new boy. That was the narrative that ran through Leaving Neverland and was explicitly stated over and over again. And so it was very inconvenient to have this other accuser in the background who was a girl. What they do in Leaving Neverland 2 is they sort of just gloss over it by saying, it's a girl, but she's a tomboy, but we really get no detail at all about this accuser. But the allegation, just to be clear, is that she received a settlement at the time in the 1980s. So they're not saying that the estate has settled with her. They're saying she made allegations in the 80s and she received a settlement. However, they do not show evidence of any settlement agreement, but they do show a series of checks for large amounts of money, like $150,000, and then another check for another amount, and so on.
They don't mention her name at all.
No name.
She's Jane Doe.
No, that's another thing I was going to ask you. I mean, are you aware of anybody in Michael's life around that time who would have been the right age and gender and would have had another reason to be receiving checks of that size?
In the 80s?
Yeah, late 80s.
No. I would definitely have to think about it because I'm very curious to see who this person is, because I thought it was someone older. I mean, in terms of, it would be in the 80s, it would be, how old would they have been now?
Well, I'm 42 and I was born in 82.
Okay, well.
So, however that is.
Yeah.
So they'd be probably about 50 now.
I'm just trying to figure this out because at the end of the day, like, I mean, I can understand people not wanting to put their name out there and stuff like that, but I just find all of this very cowardly, to be honest, in general, when things are done under seal, or if you are someone that has been abused, you want to put an abuser away. Anyone else that gets abused after that fact, that's on you. And I just think that that's just a very cowardly way of keeping your name out there. I'm out of the public, or out of, not coming forward now. And I don't think it's some kind of non-disclosure agreement or anything like that, because that's never stopped anyone else. Anyone that's had a non-disclosure from Michael, you had to sign one every time you entered Neverland, and that's never stopped anyone from talking.
Correct me if I'm wrong. With this Jane Doe, we have evidence of payments being made to her, but there's nothing to suggest that she made any allegations. That's an assumption. Is that correct? These could be checks for making an appearance somewhere or some other reason. That we don't have any actual evidence that she has made accusations of sexual abuse.
I think what we know is that later on she was represented by Wade and James's lawyers briefly, at which time she was contending abuse. What we have never seen any evidence of is that she was contending abuse at the time she received the payments. So Vincent Finaldi says in the documentary, she made allegations, she received a settlement, and here are all the checks. Right, well, he doesn't say here are the checks, but Dan Reed puts them on the screen. What they don't put on the screen is any evidence that these checks were in any way connected to a settlement. Mm-hmm. So it's slightly mysterious at the moment. But yes, there definitely was a period a few years ago, like maybe 2 years before Leaving Neverland, where she was making allegations and she was represented by Wade and James's lawyers.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Right, but we don't know if she made allegations back in the 80s.
No.
Or we don't know what those payments back in the 80s were for. We know that she joined Wade and James. And are we certain it's the same Jane Doe as well?
Yes, I think so, because the same checks were published at the time in some kind of court filing. So I remember seeing the checks back then.
Okay.
So
now Taj...
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so why did she leave the court filing aspect of it with Wade and
Yes,
James?
that's another unanswered question. So the whole thing is very shrouded in mystery. So they use her in this sequence as part of the pattern, and they use her as the first complainant before Geordie. But there are lots of unanswered questions about this case, and it's presented, of course, by Dan Reed in a completely unquestioning way where none of these questions are asked. So I was just wondering whether you as a family member had any insight, but it sounds like
Well, there's not much.
You're
to
as
go
in the
on.
dark as the rest of us.
I mean, literally, a Jane Doe is a Jane Doe. That is in itself not helpful at all, and that's why I was curious of why she left the lawsuit. Then, if it was something that was going to help them.
Now, I did want to talk to you, Taj, also, because I don't know if anyone's told you that you're featured in the show, but there's a segment of the show where they are basically attacking anybody who suggested that the allegations from Wade and James had anything to do with money. And they show a compilation of you saying it's about money, of your dad saying that it's about money, of Tom Mesereau saying it's about money, of John Branca saying it's about money. And this is done in a way which is clearly designed to attack and criticize people who are saying that it's about money. So had anybody told you that you're in the show?
No, not at all. But it is about money. But no one had told me that I was in the show.
I wanted to just mention something at this point. There is a lot of criticism. It happens more than once in Leaving Neverland 2 that there is criticism of people saying that Wade and James's lawsuit is about money. So I just wanted to read from a court document briefly. So this is a court document which was stamped by the court in December 2014, and the title of the document is Third Amended Complaint for Childhood Sexual Abuse, if anybody wants to look it up. And it's filed on behalf of Wade Robson before he was even represented by Finaldi. And this document includes a passage which is all about how the amount of money Wade Robson should receive should be calculated. I just want to read briefly from this court document because I know that Dan Reed has given interviews before saying it's not about money. He's included his two primary accusers saying it's not about money. So let's just read from this document, registered with the court in December 2014. Quote, "But for the psychological injury, illness, and damage caused by the childhood sexual abuse as alleged herein, plaintiff would have continued as one of the most successful talents in the entertainment industry." I'll just pause there so the listeners can gather themselves. "Virtually no other individual to date in the entertainment industry has achieved success in so many diverse areas. It's not a question of whether plaintiff would have been successful. Plaintiff had already been successful in the following areas. 1. As a recording artist signed to a major label, as well as having been offered several other major label record deals. 2. A multi-platinum selling songwriter and music producer whose songs are contained on albums which have sold in excess of 17 million copies worldwide. 3. As a dancer and Emmy Award-winning choreographer, as well as having been a talent judge on a major network television program. 4. Director of live stage productions, major concert stadium tours, numerous television performances at the Grammys, MTV Video Music Awards, Billboard Awards, and many others, directing music videos and theatrical motion pictures. And 5. Acting, having hosted his own MTV television series entitled The Wade Robson Project, as well as being offered leads in other network television series." And it goes on. It says, "One of the most successful executives in the history of the music business, having sold his company and redacted for $2.7 billion, personally identified plaintiff as one of the 3 most talented songwriters with whom he'd worked. Very few others have been able to achieve success in so many diverse areas, all of which has now come to an end." So this is a document submitted on behalf of Wade Robson.
I cannot believe what you just read.
And he goes on to say that he wants to receive compensatory damages. So if you are contending that you were entitled to be one of the single most successful artists in the history of the entertainment industry because you're so enormously talented, but it didn't happen because you were abused by Michael Jackson, and you therefore need to receive compensatory damages for the career that you could have had but didn't, What is the minimum amount of money that you could be asking for if you are saying that you need to be compensated for the fact that you should have been but didn't become one of the single greatest talents in the history of the entertainment business? I would contend that the minimum you can be asking for is hundreds of millions of dollars. That's the minimum you could be asking for, because the biggest entertainers in the world, generally over the course of their career, earn more than $1 billion. Beyonce, Michael Jackson, Janet Jackson, Jay-Z, these are artists who generate in excess of $1 billion, right? So I would say that based on that, the minimum Wade can be asking for, according to his own court document submitted in December 2014, is hundreds of millions of dollars. And he's also asking, on top of the compensatory damages, he's also asking for punitive damages, okay, which means punishment damages. So I want to be compensated, but I also want extra damages to punish the estate for what happened to me. And that's just one of the two accusers. So can we really criticize Taj and the family and Tom Mesereau and other people for saying this is financially motivated?
Yeah.
This court document never gets talked about, but it's absolutely shocking, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that it's not about money, I mean, I might draw your attention to Wade's final statement in the documentary where he says, whatever is the final outcome, I don't really see how I lose. And if that sounds familiar to you, I might remind you of Evan Chandler's words back in the 90s when he said, if I go through with this, I get everything I want. There's a very similar mindset there.
Definitely.
You know?
Yeah.
Does anybody think Wade Robson is one of the greatest talents in the history of the entertainment industry, in the interest of balance?
You know, I am shocked to hear what you just read, and that was about Wade.
Yeah.
Because none of that ever has gone through my head, ever.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I thought
he's
at first,
better than Michael. What are you talking about?
at first I thought he was
Right.
talking about Justin Timberlake, but then I was like, even that was a stretch. So
that was a big stretch, yes.
So I was like, okay, who's he comparing himself to at that point?
Now, Anika, you've seen the show.
Yes.
I pointed out some of the things I spotted which I thought were not handled in an honest way, like the supposed match between the photos and the description, although, as I say, that was fudged by having somebody say, oh, I heard it matched, rather than actually saying it matched. And also the treatment of the settlement, the way the settlement was described as having ended the criminal case, when in fact the criminal case lumbered on for a very long time afterwards. Did you spot anything else that I have overlooked there? Was there anything that you spotted in the show that you thought also was not particularly honest or fulsome in the way it was described?
I think their presentation of the legal process so far was somewhat disingenuous. So they seemed to be complaining about what had happened thus far and were saying that it was an attempt to hide the real issues at play. And the question initially was certainly looking at whether the companies could be held liable. And you had to go through that process within the courts, because that's the first question. Michael's not here himself to be liable. Could the companies be liable if this did indeed happen? And they seem to paint it as a way in which, clever lawyers were trying to wriggle their way out of this, rather than explaining that this is the course you have to follow and why we've ultimately reached this position.
And just for the audience's sake, you are a lawyer, aren't you, Anika?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's right, actually. And just for anyone that's listening that does not know the intricate backstory of what happened, because we do pick up new listeners all the time, Wade Robson initially filed a creditor's claim, and he filed that under seal, meaning in secret. So he filed effectively an invoice with Michael Jackson's posthumous estate and asked to be paid secretly for alleged abuse. And Michael Jackson's estate refused to pay him, and it was after that that he went public, and this turned into a lawsuit. Now, he said initially that he was entitled to claim out of time. Okay, so after somebody dies, there is a period of time in which you can come forward and say, I want to demand some money for whatever reason. He came forward after that period, but he submitted a sworn statement signed under oath on penalty of perjury, in which he said, "I am entitled to claim out of time. And the reason I'm entitled is because I didn't know Michael Jackson had an estate that I could claim from. I've only just found this out, and it was a big surprise to me, and therefore I should be entitled to claim out of time." And if the court had found that that was true, it may well have allowed him an exception and allowed him to claim out of time. But it wasn't true. It was brazen perjury. And the Michael Jackson estate was able to demonstrate that it was brazen perjury because Wade Robson not only knew that Michael Jackson had an estate, but had engaged in business activities with Michael Jackson's estate. He'd been a VIP guest at the red carpet premiere of the estate's posthumous film, This Is It. He'd written a chapter in the estate's posthumous book, The Michael Jackson Opus. He'd applied to be the director of the Michael Jackson estate's posthumous Cirque du Soleil tribute show in Las Vegas, MJ1, and had actually been offered the job, or been close to being offered the job, but had then welched on the agreement because he got offered the opportunity to direct a feature film in the Step Up series. That then went tits up, and he came back to the estate and asked if he could have the job back on the Cirque show, and they said no. And this all happened over a period of years, and there are emails that were sent from his managers and agents to him saying, "The Michael Jackson estate wants to have a meeting with you. The Michael Jackson estate executives are keen to talk to you." So he had been actively negotiating with the Michael Jackson estate at one point. So the estate presented all of this evidence to the judge in the case and said, "We want a summary judgment." A summary judgment is basically where the estate says, "We don't need a jury. We say that the facts are so clear-cut that the judge should be able to make the decision without the need for a jury." And the reason, the way that that is made fair is that the law says that on any point where a reasonable or rational juror could believe the claimant, i.e. Wade Robson, they must presume in favor of Wade Robson. Now, the evidence was so overwhelming that the judge was unable to find in favor of Wade Robson because it was demonstrable that Wade Robson had had knowledge of and meetings with and communication with Michael Jackson's estate long before he submitted this sworn statement signed under oath on penalty of perjury saying he didn't know the estate existed. So the reason Wade's case was tossed initially was actually because he was caught committing brazen perjury. Now, the way this is framed in Leaving Neverland 2, and Leaving Neverland 1 actually, is, oh, it's just a technicality. Because I was too late, I wasn't allowed to bring a claim. And that this claim is repeated in Leaving Neverland 2. Dan Reed can be under no illusion by this point that it was as simple as that. He cannot. Because after he included this claim in the first one in 2019, it was pointed out over and over again that it wasn't true. But there it is in Leaving Neverland 2 again. Oh, it was a technicality because we were too late. They were allowed to claim late if they had a good reason. Wade Robson claimed under oath he had a good reason, and that good reason turned out to be a tissue of lies. So he wasn't thrown out purely on a technicality that he was out of time. He was thrown out because he was caught lying under oath about claiming that he had a good reason for being out of time. This is when the case had to be reborn as a case against the companies. And if you read the original complaints are all about Michael Jackson was this incredibly devious and manipulative person who managed to pull the wool over everybody's eyes and trick everybody into thinking he was a great person, but secretly he was a child molester. When it became clear that Michael Jackson could not be posthumously pursued, suddenly that was scrubbed, and it became everybody around Michael Jackson knew what he was doing and was involved in it, and therefore we're going to sue the companies. And that's where we are now. And you're right, Anika, the way it's presented in the documentary is that the estate is kind of hiding behind technicalities, but it's just the law. I always say this to journalists when I'm talking to journalists. Whenever you read something in a newspaper and it says, oh, someone got off on a technicality, technicality is a synonym for the law. you don't get off on a technicality. It's the law. The law says you were entitled to be found not guilty. The law says the case was not pursuable. So I really object to people saying things like someone got off on a technicality. It's like, what is a technicality? So anyway, that is the backstory. I want to get onto another thing that happens in the show, which is that Dan Reed presents some correspondence where he says that he has been begging, in his own words, he says he's been begging Michael Jackson's representatives to participate in Leaving Neverland 2, and they have refused. And so because they've refused, he's had to interview some fans instead. I would argue that that is an extremely dubious suggestion, and that is not the real reason that he's spoken to the fans, and certainly not the fans that he's spoken to. Jenny, you are friends with Andy Senior, who is one of the people who is interviewed in Leaving Neverland 2, one of the three sort of representatives of the fan community. Now, my understanding is that Andy sat down with Dan Reed for quite a long time when that interview was filmed. Can you tell us what you know about Andy's meeting with Dan Reed, how long it lasted, and what your understanding was of the way that that interview went?
Yes. So that interview happened a while ago, maybe almost a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago. So I knew it was happening because he went out to LA to interview people because he's making also his own documentary. So I know that they talked for a while. I also know that Andy had his own camera, whether he had someone else with him or his own camera just filming, kind of like Michael would do with his personal cameras, like we saw with the Bashir after that, the footage you were never meant to see. So Andy told Dan, or Dan reached out to Andy, I think, and wanted to talk with him. And Andy agreed, but said, I need my cameras there also, which Dan said yes to. And it's funny when they say, I saw a screenshot where they were talking about Andy being a fan. He obviously likes Michael, but he's a pop culture YouTube channel, right? So when this came up and he did his research, that's when he foreshortened that knew Michael never did anything like this. So, I mean, I guess he's a fan, but it's his job to research and find these things out. And so a few years ago, he did all the research, and that's what led him to believe that Michael is completely innocent. So I don't know if he's going to have any of this footage in his documentary of him and Dan, but I really like what he says in there, and I like at the end. I was glad Dan actually kept in at the end where he says they're out for a money grab, and you are too. And Andy said that pointing directly at Dan Reed and said, and you are too. So I'm glad that Dan left that part in. But yeah, that happened a while ago. And so he's the one who contacted me probably a little over 2 months ago because somebody from Dan's people contacted him about using that very short clip of me on one of his YouTube shows. So that's how I even knew that it might be a possibility, but it was through Andy.
And do you have any knowledge as to the length of the interview that Andy and Dan recorded? Are we talking 10 minutes, an hour, 2 hours? How long were they sat talking for?
Right, because he's only in Leaving Neverland for like 30 seconds, right? Something short, a short time frame.
Yes, he's in it for a very brief period, and he's edited in an uncharitable way, which I'll talk to Paul about in a minute.
Of course.
But yeah, I just want to get an idea of how much footage Dan Reed had from which he culled the clips that he chose to include.
So from what I can remember when we first talked about this last year, it could be upwards of an hour or so that they were together. Now, whether they were filming the whole time, I'm not sure, but I know they were together for a while, longer than 30 seconds. Like, I know they were together and having a discussion for a while. I don't know exactly how long, but I'm sure that Dan edited it just how exactly he wanted it to and put it exactly where in the documentary he wanted it to. But yeah, they were together for, if I had to guess, at least an hour, with Andy's cameras also going.
Now, Paul, when we began recording earlier, you said that later in the show you wanted to talk about some of the way that the documentary had been edited and the way it had been sort of constructed into a particular narrative. And I think that's definitely the case around the presentation of the fans, as it is sort of described within the show. Just talk us through what you were alluding to earlier when you said that you had views on the way that it had been edited and constructed.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, most people, when they watch television or content or whatever, they just sort of let it float by and they absorb it and they just take it for granted that whatever's been said and is happening is the reality of it. And you talk about reality television, which most people in the industry who work in reality television or other things like reality television know that it's very much far from reality. Essentially, we always say editing has the power to not only improve a story, but to rewrite a story. And, to quote a common phrase, with that great power comes great responsibility. And when you think about, Michael obviously talked about this in his music through things like Tabloid Junkie. But I keep coming back to when I was watching this, I kept thinking, just because someone says it, I mean, those are very powerful words. Really think about that. Like, if just because someone says it, in what is a somewhat professionally produced TV show, does not necessarily mean that it's all true. People don't always look at who's saying it, and they don't always look at who the subtitle is of who they are and research that particular person and find out if they have credibility or a lack of it. There are interviews throughout the entire documentary, lawyers, Wade and James, and then what Dan Reed would call these naysayers. And they're both treated extremely differently in the editing and the presentation. As an editor, you have so much control over how you present somebody. You have, in a nutshell, the ability to make someone look really good and credible, or the ability to make someone look really bad and not credible. I believe there's a lot of that going on in this documentary, and the stuff with Andy from Popcorn Planet is a perfect example of that, where basically you've got all of the slick, well-edited interviews from Wade and James and the lawyers, and they've done so well to sort of make them come out really, really well. And then you've got Andy, and then we'll talk about some of the fans he also interviewed, where it's not just, how do I put this? They've actually gone, I think, over a line of what you'd say would be ethical in terms of how they present people. So Andy in particular, what he is saying is absolutely credible. He's prepared, he's researched, understandably nervous, but the raw editing way they've put this together, it undermines his credibility completely. As I said, with Wade and James and the lawyers, it's all slick and perfect. They're credible. When it gets to people like Andy, all of a sudden Dan Reed introduces a completely new style of documentary filmmaking and editing, where he's going to start revealing behind-the-scenes moments that should never have really made it onto the screen. He did not do that for the lawyers or for Wade or for James, although all of that footage exists. You guys have hit the nail on the head. You don't record an interview for 5 minutes. You record an hour or 2 hours, and then you edit and choose the best parts. All of these clips are so carefully chosen to push the narrative that Dan Reed wants to push in his documentary. So poor Andy, I feel so bad for him. All the parts that would normally get edited out, if you're being ethical and respectful, he's included to make him look really bad. So he's put parts where the poor guy's going, oh, hang on a sec, let me just check my notes to check that this is correct. And Dan has left that in on purpose. He's made him look like he doesn't know what he's saying, that maybe he forgot what he was talking about. It'll cut to a nice close-up of him saying what he wants to, and then all of a sudden it'll cut back to this sort of raw behind-the-scenes vibe of like, oh, hang on. It's a completely different way where he is undermining the credibility of this interviewee, and it's so unethical and unfair. And from there, it just gets worse. He's included 2 or 3 fans or, the naysayers. And again, so carefully chosen clips. He would have had possibly a whole bunch of people that he contacted and interviewed. They would have all spoke for a few hours. He would have just, set it rolling and just let them talk and talk and talk and talk. And understandably, some of these people are not professional public speakers. I mean, Wade and James are actors. The lawyers are used to public speaking. So they're under the lights. They've got Dan Reed there. This is a pretty intimidating situation. And so they're saying hours of stuff, and Dan Reed is just looking and going, oh, there we go. Oh, that's a good bit. Let's use that. Oh, that makes them look bad. He's 100% has the purpose and the objective of making them look bad. So the first guy, it's pretty sad because, this guy's sort of fumbled a few times and said a few things that, maybe he shouldn't have said this or he shouldn't have said it that way. And he might have said a whole bunch of amazing things, but they've just gone and go, oh, brilliant, rubbing his hands together. Oh, there we go. We got him. Let's use that. Let's use that. And then the same thing, the next girl that they use, it looks like they've cut, 6 or 7 times in the space of 30 seconds to edit what looks like a montage of the worst possible things and moments that she said in that 1 or 2 hour interview. And it's really, really unfair the way they've presented that. And then they do a third guy who you think they would go, oh, let's keep editing them in the same way. But they've edited him smooth and slick and back to the style they were using for James and Wade. And then you go, why is that? Oh, because this fan was a fan and decided now that he thinks Michael is guilty. So all of a sudden they're giving this credibility to him. So it's so obvious. It's quite common in filmmaking that we have the choice to choose what we want and manipulate the story. We do it in feature films and in movies. We do it in documentaries. It's what we do as editors and storytellers and creative filmmakers. But there's a difference between whether you have an agenda and you're trying to present it as if it's real and if it's the way it was done, and the manipulation that goes along where you catch them at their weakest and then you exploit it. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of that going on where you sort of go, this is really unfair. He hasn't just, say, interviewed 10 people and picked the 2 or 3 that represent the fans the worst, but he's even gone that step further where he said, I'm going to actually manipulate the editing and cut it all together so it sounds like they're saying this. I'm going to include sort of somewhat secret behind the scenes footage which undermines them. The thing about editing is you can actually control how you want to present someone. So I could re-edit that whole documentary if someone said, look, what I want you to do is take all the footage. I want you to make the lawyers and James and Wade look really bad. Every time they sort of stumble or ask Dan Reed, oh, what was that thing I was going to say? Or they forgot something, or, they paused or messed up. I could use all of that and take everything they said and pick all the parts where they look weird or they look sort of dodgy or whatever. You could manipulate it in a way with all the same material to present them in a negative light. And then I could take that same footage, those hours of the fan footage, and go, oh, they should have included this person maybe, and also this person, or of the people they did include, we could have actually used this part, they spoke really well here, they spoke really well there. I mean, the guy from Popcorn Planet, Andy, I'm 100% certain that he was so well prepared, so well organized that he would have said really good things, really clear. He would have spoken well, he would have made his points, and they would have been really great, but not for Dan Reed's narrative. So he's taken all the parts that he wants and he's just tried to make them all come across in a certain way. It is very, very, very heavily manipulated to put across the point that Dan Reed wants to make. That's kind of common in documentary that we do that, but he's taken it a step further, and the whole idea of it being balanced, he's treated them both differently. If you're going to treat them both the same, if you're going to use the behind the scenes style or whatever, that's one thing, but he hasn't. He's gone for the slick with the people he wants you to believe, and he's gone for the undermining technique of editing the worst parts and the behind the scenes mistakes to undermine these people and make them look like they don't know what they're talking about, because that helps to serve his narrative.
And I will say 2 things, and you are, every single thing you said is 100% what happens, especially anything about Michael Jackson. And with Andy, think of how much information is out there about Michael Jackson and allegations since 93. He wasn't following back since 93. Like, I don't know when he started doing his research and everything. I know speaking to Taj a few years ago, that got him even more like looking into it. But it's okay to have notes because you maybe want to say things. And also, he was asking Dan Reed questions, I believe. He had notes in front of him, probably so he could ask Dan some questions or to remind himself to talk about this section or that part. There's so much information when it comes to Michael Jackson that sometimes it's okay to write stuff down because there's important parts that you want to get out there. And then also, he put out a YouTube video either the day Leaving Neverland 2 came out or the day after. I'm not sure. I forget. I encourage everyone to go watch it. Andy, I'm talking about on Popcorn Planet, because he says he's not encouraging anyone to watch Leaving Neverland 2. He doesn't support it. and he just tells his side, why he decided to speak to Dan. And it's a very good, because he told me before it came out, he said he knew that Dan was trying to put him in looking bad, trying to throw him bait and whatever else. I can't remember like any more details, but he did make this 12-minute long video on his YouTube channel just talking about it. And again, saying he 100% believes in Michael's innocence. He's looked into everything. He's done his research and he doesn't support it. So.
And just to add to that, Dan asked me to be in Leaving Neverland too. And I made exactly that point to him. What guarantee do I have that you are going to fairly represent me? Because the power of the editing lies with you. You can manipulate, you can almost change the effect of what I'm trying to say to be the complete opposite. So how do I know that you're not going to do that? He said he would show me in advance the clips of any interview that I was going to do before they went into the actual documentary. So I said to him, that's fine, but actually what counts is not just the bit of me that you're using, but the way in which you're using it. What comes before, what comes after, what background music are you going to play? You know, all these things tell a story in themselves. I mean, I was never going to do it, but he obviously wasn't prepared to let me have any insight into those things.
And it is placement of interviews is a big deal in these documentaries. And that's why when I approved a 3-second clip of me, it's because it was only 3 seconds long. I just say that we become lawyers, we become investigators, we become, you know, I forget the other word I used. And then at Conrad Murray trial, we became doctors because we were watching it and looking into it. And I was like, if he can somehow twist up 3 seconds of something I'm saying, then that's on him. But that's the main reason I gave permission. I mean, obviously to defend Michael, but it was such a short clip that I couldn't think of a way that he could flip it or split it up into 2 different parts, because that's exactly right. And Anika, like, it's placement, it's music, it's what comes before, it's what comes after. I mean, it's everything combined.
Exactly. It's all about the context. It's about how you construct something. I mean, some people who don't really understand the technical or creative side of editing, they always just think, oh, yeah, they shoot films, they shoot things, and then someone just puts it together like a piece of IKEA furniture or something. And it's like, no, there are 30 different ways, 100 different ways you can edit the same material and create a different meaning. I used to teach extensively, you know, in film schools, and I would give all the students the exact same footage and say, go away independently and then come back and we'll watch them all. And you'd be amazed at how different they are with a different person using the exact same material. So the editor has such great power, and the director who works closely with the editor to say, this is what I want, can totally change something. You can create a new meaning just by what you put before it, what you put after it. And like you were talking about, the music and the way it's all constructed. It's such a convincing construction of things that are all working together to manipulate you. You know, you take out the music, for example, at one point, and all of a sudden there's less impact, there's less emotion. You're like, oh, but regular folks, when they watch things, they don't understand there's all these filmmaking elements working together to create something and make you feel something. And in some cases, to manipulate you. And, you know, we do that in feature films. We want to manipulate the audience. We want them to laugh. We want them to cry. And it's all constructed with music and this, and that's normal. But yeah, there is an ethical line in documentary where you ideally don't have an agenda that you want to push and then present it as if it's reality. When I watched this documentary, I was actually, you know, a little amazed at how much they were trying to create a certain feeling and create a certain idea where an audience might watch it and they're just going to assume that, oh yeah, that's what happened. I mean, I could take a very simple example. You know, they use close-ups during the interviews and then they cut to wide shots. Mm-hmm. Now, they're not just cutting to the close-up for emotion or impact. Every time there's a cut from a different angle in this documentary of an interview, they're hiding a cut. They've cut something out and they're using that to join the pieces together. There's also cuts hidden underneath when they've got photos or footage and you're just hearing the voice. There's all these places that you can cut and change what someone's saying, take parts out, add parts in, move them around. You can create something that sounds exactly the way you want it to be said. And then you can use filmmaking techniques like, oh, we'll put some photos over it or we'll cut to a different angle to hide the cuts. And the audience just doesn't think about it. They don't think twice. They just go, oh yeah, that's what's happening. So, for example, there's a shot where, James is sitting outside with his wife in a wide shot, and he's saying something. Then it cuts to his wife's close up, and then you hear the audio of James continuing to talk. But that's a different piece of audio. They've cut away to her to use a different bit of audio of James. Then they cut back to a wide shot where you see them both, and then his wife says something. It's 3 or 4 completely different pieces, but it's all edited and plays as if that's how it happened in real time in that moment. And again, that's standard stuff. People don't think about it, but people just need to be aware that things are edited. And even at the very basic level, they could just be taking out ums and ahs or less concise talking, or it could be a manipulation of dialogue to create a new meaning. And you see a lot of that, as Charles was talking about some of the ways that the LAPD and lawyers and things, they were presenting things in the early stages of the documentary. I think one point she said something like, the Chandler allegations were litigated very extensively, and then they cut. There's no mention of, and what were the results of that outcome? And instead they cut to the LAPD woman saying, all the salacious parts of her story and saying, oh, Michael wouldn't use the F word. Then they cut. You got to think, well, what did she say next? It implies what Dan Reed wants it to imply. It's very clever manipulation. And most people wouldn't even analyze or think about it. But did she start by saying, the accusation was Michael did this and that? But they just cut to Michael did this and that. And it sounds like fact. So you have to ask yourself, what did they say next? What did they say before? There's a lot of spin on it. You could totally take the same material and spin it another way. And I just feel a little bit like they've used all of these tools to create something which, as I said, focuses on making sure the lawyers on their side, James, Wade, they're all respected and shown in a way that makes them as strong and clear and credible as possible. And everyone that they're trying to half-heartedly include, because those were the complaints on the first Leaving Neverland, you didn't show both sides, he's just gone crazy going, well, I'm just going to show the other side, but I'm not going to show the other side in the same way, with the same respect and the same way of editing. I'm going to manipulate them to the point of pushing to make them look like the worst people on the planet. So you just dismiss all these crazy Michael fans or any naysayers to what he's trying to say. So there's a lot going on from an editorial perspective.
Well, there's also issues around, so for example, one of the people that's included is Ron Zonen, one of the prosecutors from the 2005 trial, who's speaking very authoritatively about the Chandler case, which I don't believe he was involved in. But also, he is someone who has a history of giving interviews where he gets things wrong. So, for example, he's given interviews to TV shows in the past where he says, our case was that Michael Jackson was drugging children with Versed and then abusing them. And you're watching it going, no, Ron, that wasn't your case. That was absolutely not your case. That was never suggested at the trial whatsoever. So you have somebody in the editing suite, somebody in the director's chair who has a vested interest, clearly, and basically admits freely that they have a vested interest in portraying Michael Jackson in the worst possible way. So you take someone like Ron Zonen, who has a history of getting it wrong and quite seriously exaggerating things in interviews, but you don't tell the audience that Ron Zonen, oh, by the way, just before we show you this guy, he does have a history of getting it wrong and exaggerating. So it's all about the information that you do present and that you don't present. I'm sure that if I had wanted to, I could have sat down in front of a camera for Dan Reed. I'm sure that if I had sought him out, I could have done that. And I might well have spoken about what I spoke about earlier with Wade Robson, where he was caught lying about his knowledge of the Michael Jackson estate, and that's why his case was thrown out. Or I could have talked about how he fought hard to keep his emails out of the case and actually lied under oath about his emails to try to keep them out of the case, and then was caught lying and had to disclose all the emails. And I could have talked about how, for example, when those emails were disclosed, they revealed he lied under oath in his deposition about his attempts to sell a book. Just as one example, he's asked in his deposition, did you try and sell a book? And he says, no, I wrote a book, but it was purely for my own therapeutic purposes. I never tried to sell it. When his emails were disclosed, emails he'd lied to the court to try to cover up, when they were disclosed, they revealed he'd sent them to at least 3 publishing houses who'd all turned it down. also he was caught in his emails. It showed him researching other people's allegations against Michael Jackson at the time he was writing that book and emailing the links to himself. It also showed him asking his mum questions about, I've read this on the internet, I've read that on the internet, I don't remember any of it. Did it happen? And his mum replies and says, wow, none of this is true. And then somehow these details end up appearing in his story anyway. I could have talked about all of these things, but I know that if I had, Dan Reed wouldn't have included them. So I would be interested to know what it was that actually made these fans think it was a good idea to sit down in front of Dan Reed's camera. And I wonder whether in some cases that the fact that they even agreed to do it was an indication that they were the kind of people that were not going to maybe make the best argument, the strongest argument. Anika, you were approached by Dan Reed and chose not to speak to him, which was the sensible decision, I think. Can you tell us a bit about how you received that approach, what your interactions were with Dan Reed?
Yes, he approached me via Brandon Ogborn, who did the Telephone Stories podcast. He knew, I think, that if he approached fans directly, the doors would just be slammed in his face immediately. So he went through a third party as a sort of way in. So I spent some time speaking to Brandon just to understand what the ask was, what his role was, and what exactly Dan was looking to do. Brandon explained that Dan had approached him basically to approach fans. He was getting paid to do that, but that was his involvement in Dan's project. So as we talked, I spoke to him a couple of times and he said, look, why don't you just speak to him directly? Can I pass on your details? So I agreed to do that. I then met with Dan and I just found him to be very, very arrogant. You know, I think he was trying to maybe rile me up a little bit. He was using a certain language to describe acts that Wade had alleged that Michael had committed, but he was using very explicit language, which just was not necessary in that circumstance. And I very much got the impression for him that his general approach to life is that if he believes something to be the case, it is the case. There's nothing then you can really say to shake his view on that. And it was a sort of very arrogant self-belief. He asked me to be in the show and presented it as an opportunity for me, presented it as really the only chance I would have to have my say on how I viewed the allegations from Wade and James. And, you know, very much made clear, I have the platform, you don't, and I'm offering you a chance to get your side of the story out. And that if I didn't do it, I mean, I don't think these were exact words, but this is certainly the impression I got. If I didn't do it, essentially it's down to me that Michael doesn't have a public defense. In the end, I never intended to do it anyway, but in the end I told him I wouldn't, especially because of the issue with the editing. I asked him, knowing that he'd say no anyway, I still asked him if I could be in the final edit room and have some say over at least how I was put into it. And of course that was a no. And I told him that I wouldn't take that risk because I knew that I could say Michael is not guilty and that could be edited to show me saying Michael is guilty. And it just wasn't a risk that I was willing to take.
Have you ever heard from him or his production team since then?
No.
Okay. So those of us who've been around this case for a long time know that there is an agenda almost always when the media approaches you and asks you to talk about it. And I've experienced it myself. I've experienced people from the BBC ringing me and telling me that they want me to come on, but I have to say a particular thing if I come on. I've experienced being debooked or unbooked because they didn't realize what my perspective was. And when they found out what it was, they decided not to platform me. And I've also been edited in a manipulative way, as you were saying earlier. Sometimes it's about what comes before and what comes after. I did a TV show once where I was interviewed for about an hour, and they included me for maybe 2 minutes. And after it aired, I was spammed with abuse from people saying, "Why did you say Michael Jackson died of a Demerol addiction?" Which, of course, I hadn't said because it wasn't true. And when I checked it out, what they'd done, they'd edited one person saying that, and another person saying that, and then me in the middle saying something totally different, but removed of context and placed between those two people. It sounded like I was agreeing with them. It sounded like I was saying the same thing. So I experienced it myself. That was probably close, over 10 years ago now, and I don't really do TV anymore for that reason. And Anika, you and I have a mutual friend who was approached recently and asked to go on to the Piers Morgan show on YouTube to discuss this case. And I strongly advised them not to do it. And they were like, "No, but if I don't do it, they might get someone dumb on who just says all the wrong things. What if you and I had a conversation before, like a dummy interview, and we talk about the allegations because I want to make sure I've got the key facts?" And I was like, "They're not going to ask you about the allegations. They're not going to ask you for any facts about the allegations. You do realize that when you go on there, that's not what they're going to ask you." They do not want to have a sensible conversation with you about the facts of the case. That's not why they've asked you on. And luckily they didn't do it. And there is an argument to the contrary, which is, the other day I was watching an utterly ludicrous interview that 2-day bodyguard Matt Fidesz was giving to Dan Wooten, where he was making all sorts of preposterous claims and factually inaccurate statements. And I suppose you could make an argument that, okay, it would have been better if someone who knew what they were talking about had gone on and done it instead. But it's just not worth the risk, I don't think.
I think as fans also, we need to be aware of our own limitations, and particularly because we've pulled apart Leaving Neverland, and as a fan group, we do it very well. I think people like Dan Reed have wisened up to that. So if someone's going to go against him or someone's going to put themselves forward, I really believe that that person has to be pretty squeaky clean. There shouldn't be anything in that person's background that Dan could pick up on and say, well, who are you to speak because of X, Y, or Z reason? Or, well, look what I found out about you. Because that would undermine us immediately. And I think there's very few people at the moment who should really be putting themselves forward. Charlie, I've told you a number of times, I think you are one of them. You are extremely eloquent and you know these cases inside out. But I think other people should be very, very cautious in what they decide to do, because at the end of the day, they're not going to give us the time to go into the details. They're not going to just give you a monologue, if you like, and just say, sure, educate us. And if there's anything that Dan could later pick up on, that's only going to look bad for everyone as a whole.
Well, and that's why, because I also got approached to go on Piers Morgan, and I talked to Charles after, because I wish my brain could hold all the information that your brain holds, Charles. I did not want to misspeak. Once I found out who was going to be on the panel, the thought of misspeaking or accidentally saying the wrong date of something, and I didn't want to even put myself in that position, especially since the show was about Leaving Neverland 2, which hadn't even at that point aired yet. And they wanted all of us to go on and talk about something that nobody has seen.
Exactly.
Yeah, I still haven't seen it, but I'm not going to go on. If Piers Morgan show called me and said, we want to talk about the 2005 trial and the Arvizos, that's totally different. I was there for that. If it was like a roundtable discussion with an audience, maybe asking questions, I'll do that. But just going on Piers Morgan show with a panel of who knows, they were asking a lot of people to come on. A lot of people declined their invitation, me being one of them. But it's because of that. I didn't want to. I'm not good in situations where if I misspeak, then all of a sudden someone's coming at me with just coming at me with things. And
exactly.
So Piers Morgan show was that was a hard one.
You can be the most well-spoken, well-rehearsed, well-researched person, but you've got to remember, unless you do this for a living or on a regular basis, all of a sudden you're put in front of cameras, you're put in front of lights, you could be in a live studio session, it could be a live TV show or a live radio broadcast. It's surprising how much it affects you. And all of a sudden you get a bit tongue-tied or you forget something and you fumble. And that's when people jump on it and take advantage of it and try and undermine you or make you seem like you're not actually as credible. So you've got to be really careful when you even consider going on something to say, oh, good, I'll get to say my side of it. But you have to be aware that maybe you might actually be under a lot of pressure to try and present yourself well. And the moment you fumble, you're in trouble and they'll use that to exploit you.
Yeah. And I mean, I've been saying the same things for years and years and years. And if I say one word differently on the Pierce Morgan show, then you're exactly right. Then it's like, well, you have been lying this 25 years then because you just said this. So I didn't want to put myself in that position because they can just twist everything no matter what, especially with the words Michael Jackson in it.
Well, this is why I don't do TV. And thank you for the kind words, by the way, but I don't do TV because, firstly, if it's pre-recorded, they have the power in the edit. And secondly, if it's live, they generally are on a time limit and they have no interest in getting involved in any kind of in-depth or sensible discussion about the merits of the case or the facts of the case. They're trying to fill 7 minutes or 10 minutes with a very sensational, well, would you let your kids sleep in someone else's bed? Would you do that? You know, they don't want to talk about the credibility of the accusers. They just want to make it all about the kind of wackiness of the lifestyle that Michael had as they portray it. And before we wrap up, that's what I wanted to talk to you about, Taj. I wanted to ask you a question, which is the way the TV show is constructed clearly builds a very negative picture of Michael's sort of serial friendships with kids and his practice of having like sleepovers with them and takes the view that it was sexual and criminal. When Piers Morgan did his show the other day, he sort of came down on the side of, look, I believe in innocent until proven guilty. I don't believe he's been proven guilty. However, his conduct was so weird and so strange that I still find it very dark and disturbing, and I wouldn't have wanted my kids involved in it, for example. So I think that is something that even people who are potentially sympathetic to Michael do struggle with, especially if you are a 40-year-old man, for example, and you're a Michael Jackson fan, and you can't imagine yourself wanting to have a sleepover with a lot of kids. So what do you think Michael got out of it, firstly? And secondly, why do you think he continued to put himself in a position where he was vulnerable to these kind of allegations after the first case? You knew Michael, you lived with Michael at times, you know, you're a relative. Nobody has a better insight into him and why he was the way he was than you. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a very interesting question. I think for me, no one ever had the life that Michael Jackson had. That's first of all. So even me looking back at my adult age, I wasn't Michael Jackson. I didn't live through that life. And I didn't sacrifice my childhood like he did. And I would say that at the same time, I don't honestly think, I'm saying this to a bunch of you guys and stuff like that, I don't think people had the pure heart that Michael Jackson had. And I think that as we go on and years pass, people's heart get darker. You know, we get numb to certain things. And I think in a way, yeah, as time passes, more people can understand innocence. And I think that's where we are as a society now, is Michael Jackson was innocence. And that's the difference between him and everyone else. And so a lot of people can't put themselves in that point because they're not innocent. They can't fathom that you could be in the same bed with someone and not be sexual. That's on them. That's not on Michael Jackson. That's on them. And I say that being completely honest because I went through all this. I went through living with him. I went through growing up with him. And I can tell you that the reason why people were comfortable with it because people saw his heart and his soul and understood that aspect of it. And we don't live in that world anymore. We don't live in the world where you could leave your kids in the front lawn and not worry about them getting kidnapped. We don't live in that world anymore. And I think the farther that we get from that world, the more it's going to be like, that was strange. That was weird. I would never do that. Well, of course, because we're not there anymore. there's a lot of things we would never do anymore. But at that time, that was Michael Jackson. And I think that, I mean, the reason was because he was living vicariously through those people, because he lived vicariously through me and my brothers a lot. He would ask us things like, we'd talk about a birthday, just a simple birthday as kids. And he'd want to hear every detail. Like, what was it like? When did you guys blow the candles out and all that stuff? It was almost like he wanted to be there. And by us explaining it, because, you know, when you have friends, you go through a lot of birthdays. So you were like, well, here we go. We'll just say it. But for him, it was almost like he was there. Like he was kind of holding on to every word. Like, and then what happened? And then it's like, I will never be at that position. I mean, thank goodness. But that was the sacrifice that Michael Jackson did. And I think that people will never understand that sacrifice and never understand that he literally was holding on by a thread to his childhood. And that connection, that innocence with kids in terms of, first of all, he said it better than I've ever said it. It was always the adults that were the corrupt ones that would want his money, look at him as a dollar sign or whatever. Kids didn't do that. And so as we get older and I see this and I see people come out of the woodworks, it's not kid Wade or kid James that accused him. They didn't want anything from him except his friendship. It's adult Wade and James, because now they're looking at money. And that's the difference of what I will say. No one will ever be Michael Jackson. No one can understand Michael Jackson to that point because they didn't live his life. That's all I can say. I've been the closest to that, and I completely understand it. And if someone said that to me, would you leave your kids? I would say 100%, not even a question. And that's me.
But what about after the Geordie Chandler case? Would you have advised him to carry on, or would you have said, listen, you're vulnerable now, maybe needs to stop?
Well, I think the family did do that. And I think that he actually, if you follow the years gone by, because James's allegation is before that. Wade's allegation is pretty much before that. So
it's the Arvizos I'm thinking of, yeah.
Yeah, but the Arvizos, and I think Michael's stubborn as it is. He doesn't like anyone telling him what to do, especially if in his head, he's like, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not thinking sexual. That's on them. But I did notice that in the court case with Arvizos, he made sure Frank was there and that Michael slept on the floor. So I think there was a difference once that Geordie thing happened that was like, okay, I'm not going to fall for that anymore. But at the same time, look, I mean, I'm being very careful because I'm not him. I don't have the purity that he has in his heart to say that. And I'm kind of trying to talk through both sides of, as a family member, but also as someone that is outside the bubble and what society thinks of certain things. But yeah, I do know that the family at one time, when I say that, it's like I heard it. Okay. That the family at one time said, Michael, you got to stop with these random kids, basically. And there's family members that you can hang out with and all that stuff. And if you actually look at the trajectory of that, he did start hanging out with family members more. So, I mean, I guess I'll say that aspect of it because I know everything I say will be kind of twisted or dissected, but it's hard because I know what people think. Just like when Gavin put his head on Michael's shoulder during the Bashir thing, I went, oh gosh, because I saw it through the society's eyes. But I know what Michael was thinking. Like, I know that was nothing to him. But I also knew, I don't want to say the dirtiness of society, but it's through society's dirty lens. And there never will be another Michael Jackson, so people will never understand that.
Taj, I thought that exact same thing with the Gavin part. And I remember as soon as I saw it in the Bashir thing, I felt like, oh no.
Yeah, because
and like you know what Michael meant, but you still felt like why? Like,
here we go.
Yes.
And it wasn't, and part of that is almost like being set up in a way, and you're just like, oh, you fell for it. And that's the thing. That's the hard thing about Michael Jackson in that aspect of it is Michael's sometimes was so. It's hard to use the word innocent because the problem is that people don't understand the word innocent, but he was so not thinking that naive. I get in trouble for that word too, but I love that word. Because naive is innocence in that aspect of it. But we don't understand that because we went through societal cues. We learned from people saying, don't do that, don't do this, and whatever. Michael never went through those cues. So he's learning. It's almost like learning on the job and being like, you can't do that, Michael, and you can do this, but you can't do that. And so that's why I kind of said we lived different lives than he did. And so certain things that you would say like, oh, you would learn as a kid, he didn't learn.
I've got one final question for the two people who did see the show. It ends with the new lawyer, Carpenter, saying to Dan Reed's camera words to the effect of, I know so much more than I can tell you, and I know what Michael Jackson did. And he seems to be strongly implying that he has access to some kind of bombshell evidence that nobody knows about at the moment. Did either of you guys find that unsettling? And what are you anticipating from Leaving Neverland 3?
Well, I think straight up from a filmmaker perspective, that's just, we need a hook at the end of this non-event kind of documentary where people may have tuned in going, oh, we're going to find out how it all ended up and what happened, and then disappointed because it's like, no, that happens in 2026. You'll have to wait for part 3. So I think a big part of it is, as I said, one lawyer's gone, Vince Finaldi. John Carpenter is now in. We have to set him up for the next documentary. We have to set up sort of a cliffhanger, if you will, so that people can tune into the next one and go, oh, right, look, because otherwise if he didn't say that, people would just go, that was a waste of time. But they've been very clever and careful to say the trial date is set. That's the whole point of this documentary. The trial date is set. And then you've got John Carpenter saying, that I know more and I know what he did. I'm like, no, you didn't. Just because you say it, I come back to that same thing. Just because you say it, you weren't there. So I would say without any bombshell revelation that they would have done that anyway, just to kind of have a cliffhanger ending and trying to get people to watch the next one and keep invested. But yes, as you say, Charles, there's definitely a chance that they've got something up their sleeve, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's all just fluff.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, if they had something that big, surely we would know about it already. And what can they possibly have now that hasn't already been found in the 20, 30 years that these allegations have been leveled against Michael? If Wade and James had something that was so, such a revelation, surely that would have been revealed by now. I kind of saw it as a bit of bluster and trying to make out that they do have more than they do, because there was nothing in this show. There was absolutely nothing. So, as Paul said, they had to end it with some kind of a hook. But, I say bring it on.
And I will say the best thing I've seen this whole past week was a picture, and it says, what cannot be legally proven doesn't gain validity by making a documentary. And I think that is so true, because for the majority of people, the documentary is the facts. Like, if you don't know anything about it, the documentary to the general public is the truth, but it's not. So I just think that was a good thing to see. Like, if it can't be proven legally, what makes this documentary prove it without proof, with no evidence?
Before we wrap up, I've got some news. Leaving Neverland 2 has now got 33,000 viewers on YouTube, so it's a monster hit. Right, well, thank you all for joining us today. It's been an interesting discussion, and hopefully it will be of interest and help to our listeners. Before we say goodbye, I need to ask you all what your social media accounts are. So, Jenny, if people want to reach you on social media, how do they get to you?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at JennyW526.
Taj, how can people find you on social media?
You can find me at Taj Jackson 3.
Anika, do you want people following you or following MJ Innocent?
MJ Innocent, so we're on Twitter as at MJ Innocent UK.
And Paul?
Yep, as always, I'm generally off the grid, so not on social media, but you can contact me through the MJCast. They'll be able to find me.
And the MJCast, unsurprisingly, on all social media platforms, is the MJCast. Thank you all for listening, and we'll catch up with you in a future episode.